Hello, it's Stephen Bedard, and today I want to talk to you about the end of the world. Well, I'm going to talk to you about my views of Christian eschatology, and a lot of people will be quick to correct me and say, well, when we're talking about the return of Jesus, when we're talking about eschatology, we're not really talking about the end of the world. It's not the end of the space-time universe. It's a change in that. So I'm not being really precise with my language, but you know what? It's not the end of the world. Or maybe it is, or maybe it's not. I don't know. But anyways, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my journey in understanding the end times, as it's often called. As I have mentioned in a previous video, a lot of my theological journey has to do with the traditions that I participated in throughout my spiritual life. So I grew up Anglican. I ended up becoming a Pentecostal in my early 20s, and then by my late 20s, I had become a Baptist. And what I'm going to say is not necessarily true of every Anglican, of every Pentecostal, of every Baptist, but those traditions certainly help to shape where I have come from and where I have gone in my understanding about eschatology. So to begin with, in terms of my Anglican upbringing, we didn't talk about this. I don't remember ever hearing anyone talk about Jesus returning. That was just not a part of our discussion. We did not talk about the resurrection of the dead other than the resurrection of Jesus. That's not to say that no Anglicans do talk about that, but the church I was a part of, if it was ever mentioned, I don't remember. It certainly wasn't a major theme. The closest we ever got to talking about it is when we would be concerned about what we saw some fundamentalist Christians saying. And so I remember having a conversation with my priest, and he was quite concerned about Pat Robertson. This is back when Pat Robertson was running for president of the United States. And my priest felt that Pat Robertson was seeking to bring about a nuclear war because that would bring the return of Jesus much closer. And I don't know that that actually reflects what Pat Robertson was teaching, but that's the closest I remember in my upbringing. So we didn't talk about the return of Jesus at all. Then I became a Pentecostal. Now, I mentioned in a previous video about my time of becoming a Christian, how as I was trying to figure out what the truth was, I was working for some Christians, and they used a lot of eschatology. They wouldn't have used that phrase, but return of Jesus, rapture language, to try to bring me to a decision for Jesus. And they were from a Pentecostal type group, and so they would often say things like the rapture was going to be any minute, and I needed to accept Jesus, or else I would have to be decapitated by the Antichrist, and all that kind of, seeker-sensitive kind of evangelism. And so that was a big part of what they would say. So I didn't respond to that right at that time, but eventually I found myself in a Pentecostal church, and found that indeed, at least at this church, they really focused a lot on the return of Jesus. In fact, most of my friends at that time never expected to face physical death. They saw everyone who died as being a very sad example of someone who died before the time, because Jesus was going to return very, very soon, and that most of the church would indeed be raptured. There was no way that we were going to have to face physical death. And as someone who was scared of death at one point, that was something that was attractive to me. The idea to be able to skip the whole death process and be just taken right up to heaven, that sounded like a really good thing. And I remember at that church, we would have a morning and evening service, and the pastor would always say, come back for the evening service. Of course, only if Jesus hasn't come back, which he probably will come back this afternoon, but in case he doesn't, come out to the evening service. And so really the expectation was that it would happen soon. I remember there was one fellow there, and he was a very intelligent guy, a successful business person. He started spending his retirement savings because he had come to the conclusion that the signs were so clear that Jesus was about to return any time that there was no point in keeping a retirement savings. That would be, in some ways, a statement of a lack of faith. That he would be having money set aside for his retirement because Jesus was going to be coming back. And so he said that he was going to start spending that money. I don't know where he's at now. I suspect that he didn't spend all that money, and I suspect that he's built up that money again. But he was very sure that it was going to happen. A big part of our eschatology was the idea of the rapture. And if you're not sure what the rapture is, it's this idea that Jesus is going to come back and meet believers in the air before the end. And then there's going to be 7 years of tribulation, and then Jesus comes back again, and then that's the defeat of the Antichrist and all of that. This idea of a pre-trib rapture was considered to be the way to do it. In fact, I was at the time looking to get credentialed as a Pentecostal pastor, and you had to write out a timeline of the end times, and it was expected that you would follow the pre-tribulation rapture. There was some room for mid-trib, which meant that it was 3.5 years into the tribulation that the rapture might happen. But it was really expected at that time that you would be a pre-trib rapture person, that was the proper theology. And I just took that for granted if they were saying that. I remember someone questioning it, and the response was, well, if you want to go through the tribulation, you're welcome to do it. I intend to take the rapture. As if it was all about what our personal preferences were. There's not a whole lot in the scriptures that talk about our personal preferences determining the truth. So that got me a little suspicious. And there was a number of things that came up. One thing is I began to hear from people outside my tradition that this idea of the pre-tribulation rapture and the secret coming of Jesus, that was a very recent innovation in Christian thought, that it only had appeared in the 1800s with John Nelson Darby, and that before that there was really no discussion of that kind of thing, and that got me kind of suspicious as well. And I noticed too, as I would read the book of Revelation, it was really hard to pinpoint where in Revelation the rapture was actually taking place. And the few explanations that I heard were not very convincing. It did not look like that's what was happening. And if the rapture was so important, why wasn't it mentioned in the book of Revelation? And so I began to have a lot of doubts about these things, and I began to read more widely, and I tried to go to the scriptures without this detailed pre-understanding of what the end times are going to look like, that there was going to be a 7-year tribulation, that there was going to be a rapture, that there was going to be an Antichrist who was going to look in this specific way and do these specific things. I tried to just look at what the scriptures were saying. And I ended up arriving at a very different perspective than what I had. And so I began to look at the description of the rapture from 1 Thessalonians. And by the way, that word rapture comes from the Latin for being caught up. And it does talk about Christians being caught up in the air to meet Jesus. So that does happen. But what's being described there is actually the resurrection. And there had been a long tradition within Judaism that there would be a resurrection of the dead on the day of the Lord, that that God would raise up his people and those who had died, and they would be raised. And Christianity took over this. Jesus taught this. Paul taught this. And it was very much like that Jewish description of the resurrection, with some changes. Now, the day of the Lord would be when Jesus would return. And what would happen on the day he would return is the resurrection of the dead. And what would happen is that there would be people still alive who were followers of Jesus at that day, and they would, of course, have to be changed, because those who would receive the resurrection bodies would have to be transformed, because their bodies would be decayed and just wouldn't work anymore. And those who were still alive, they would need their bodies changed as well, because human bodies only last for so long. And we would need transformed bodies to live out through eternity. And so what's being described there is not so much the rapture as the resurrection. I think if you were able to take a time machine, go back in time and talk to the disciples and say, hey, are you excited about the rapture? They'd be like, what? What are you talking about? But if you said, are you excited about the resurrection of the dead? They would know exactly what you mean. That is the description of what's going on. Now, in some ways, this understanding of the resurrection is somewhat close to the idea of the post-tribulation rapture. It is kind of like that. However, it's not clear that there's going to be a seven years of tribulation. The number seven is extremely symbolic. Revelation, you should never call it the book of Revelations. Revelation is an apocalypse, and it is using symbolic language, and there's a lot of stuff in there that we need to take seriously, but we don't necessarily take it completely literally. So will there be tribulation? Sure, there's going to be tribulation. There has been tribulation, and there will continue to be tribulation. Maybe there'll be a greater tribulation as just before Jesus comes back. Will it last exactly for 7 years? I'm not sure about that. Again, it's a very symbolic number. But why do I prefer to call it the resurrection rather than the rapture? The difference is about our attitude towards what is happening. For me, the rapture is about a last-minute rescue from a terrible place. That's the way people who talk about the rapture, that's what they're talking about. Earth is going to hell, and Jesus is going to perform a rescue operation and get us out of here. And that's what's being described. Whereas the resurrection is something different. The resurrection is about our destiny to receive our new bodies. And it's something that, first of all, is designed for those who have already died, but is included in those who are living. But it's about being made who we are supposed to be. We are being transformed on the inside through this life, and then when Jesus returns with our resurrection bodies, our bodies will match who we are on the inside. And so it's a different attitude towards the to who we are and how we relate to the world. Now, what about the millennium? What do we do with the millennium? Well, I got to tell you, I'm pretty agnostic when it comes to the millennium, because it's really only talked about in Revelation. Some might say that there's something in there in Isaiah and some of the prophecies, and I can see that. I generally have accepted the millennium. I would generally have been premillennial. Now I'm probably leaning more towards amillennial. But I'm agnostic. I'm not ready to take a stand and say this is the way it is. It is something for us to think about. We can look at it, try to understand what's being described in Revelation there, but realize that the basic message, if you were to look at the basics of the New Testament, of the Gospels, the epistles, what it talks about is that Jesus will return, and that when Jesus returns, the resurrection of the dead will take place. That is the basic message that is been given to us, and that's what we need to hold on to. Are there going to be other things that will happen? Is there going to be an antichrist, a beast, a man of lawlessness? Now, it's not clear that those three are all exactly the same. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. There'll probably be some kind of reaction to Jesus' return, but the main thing that we focus on is Jesus will return and there will be a resurrection of the dead. And that's something that we can hold on to. So that's where I'm at right now. I would love to hear where you're at. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Feel free to subscribe to the channel and also visit me at my website, stephenjbedard.com. Thank you for watching this video, and God bless you.